The Hudson Library and Historical Societies Through the Eyes of the Artist biographical series presents art historian Felicia Zavarella-Stadelman speaking about French artist Claude Monet, generally regarded as the father of Impressionist painting. Recorded at the Hudson Library's Flood Meeting Room on February 25, 2015.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all to the Hudson Library. Tonight continues our series of featured artists. We're very fortunate to be able to host Felicia's art programs here at the library. It's certainly been a crowd favorite, and we hope that you'll continue to join us for not only her programs, but also the upcoming programs that we have over the next couple of months. We're going to be celebrating the library's 10th anniversary of being in this beautiful building, so we have a lot of exciting programs coming up over the next few months. I would like to welcome back Felicia Zavarella-Stadelman as she presents her series of artist biographical lectures, Through the Eyes of the Artist. Tonight she will present on the master of color and light, Claude Monet.
Welcome. I've heard a few of you say, this is my favorite. I always get a nice crowd with Claude Monet. I can't honestly say who my favorite is. Somebody had asked me in the audience, and I have so many favorites, but I have to say his is a little more entertaining than some of them, but I think you'll enjoy it. So listen here. He said, fiercely competitive, but immensely, or this is what's written about Claude Monet, fiercely competitive, but immensely sensitive. Astonishingly inventive, though rarely satisfied. This artist was a far more complicated figure than has been acknowledged, and he emerges as an individual of vision and virtuosity. He's the product of deeply felt experience and continues to hold significance for us today. Who do you think wrote that? Claude Monet. About himself. In 1900. He is the quintessential modest impressionist. He created more than 2,500 paintings, drawings, and pastels, and he radically altered the way that art was made and understood. So in 1900, he kind of became famous. And on an occasion of an exhibit in Paris, a journalist asked him to tell him his life story. On November 26, 1900, the newspaper Le Temps published this autobiography as told by Monet himself, and he kind of builds himself up as a legend. Many of the quotes and excerpts and stories, remember I told you this is primary source information, letters the artists wrote by themselves, to each other, to their family, journals, interviews that they had. A lot of this interview that he provided, because there was a lot of information, is in this presentation. So there was an article about him in 1900. So Claude Monet was born in Paris, November 14th, 1840. His name was Oscar Claude Monet, and later he dropped Oscar. He was the second son of Claude Adolphe and Louise, who were both second-generation Parisians. So he later describes that this Parisian atmosphere of his home was entirely concerned with commerce, he said, where everyone professed a contemptuous disdain for art. This is how he grew up. In reality, his mother, Louise, was an elegant woman, a trained soprano who painted and wrote poetry. She was an accomplished hostess, and she filled their ornate home with music and very cultured guests. Now, the young Monet spent his childhood in the Normandy coastal town of Le Havre, where his father prospered as a very successful importer and exporter, grocer, and a ship chandler. Now, the fact that he lived near the water and his father was a ship chandler had more biographical significance than you would think. It was Monet's childhood spent along the beaches that he gained that intimate knowledge of the sea and the rapidly shifting Normandy weather that would one day give him rise to his future. The sea became the contrasting background of his whole childhood. He spent a great deal of time roaming the beaches rather than being in the schoolroom, so it's no surprise that a lot of his work has water in it. He was sent to a small private school, and like many other students, he wasn't really interested in his studies. He drew a great deal of the time, mostly in the margins of his books instead of reading, and he drew these fantastic, cruel caricatures of the teachers. These are Monet's actual caricatures that he put together. This is what he said about this time. He said, "This childhood of mine was essentially one of freedom. I was born undisciplinable," which incidentally is not a word, but Monet, like Pat Cooper, used to make up his own words, and a lot of times when you read things about him, he's got a kind of a constructed language. So he was born undisciplinable. He said, "No one was ever able to make me stick to the rules, not even in my youngest days. Up until the age of 14 or 15, much to my father's great disappointment, I continued this very irregular but healthy way of life, doing these caricatures. Somehow," he said, "in between I did acquire the rudiments of basic education, including some proficiency at spelling. He said my studies went no further, and it did not cause me too much trouble, as I was able to interweave them with a number of distractions. I ornamented the margins of my textbooks. I decorated the blue paper of my exercise books with these ultra-fantastic designs and represented in the most irreverent manner possible the features of my masters, either drawing their faces in front view or profile." He said, "I quickly became very adept at this game." Now, at 16 years old, Monet actually became quite famous in the port city where he lived because of these caricatures that he drew. For years, he had been drawing cartoons of his teachers at school and giving them to his friends or to the people who asked for them. But now the demand grew so great that he started asking for $60 or 20 francs per picture. He said, "At 15, I was known by the whole of Le Havre as a caricaturist. My reputation was so well established that I was commissioned by everyone for these types of portraits. It was in effect, in consideration of the sheer number of commissions that I received, as well as the insufficiency of the allowance that I received from my mother, that prompted the audacious decision that I had to charge a fee for my portrait." So he wasn't getting enough of an allowance, and there was so much demand. He had to do it. This, of course, he said, scandalized my family. I would charge 10 to 20 francs, depending on whether I liked the look of my clients or not. This method worked extremely well. He said in a month, the number of clients had doubled, and I was able to charge a fixed rate of 20 francs without reducing it in any way for the demand. Had I continued this way, today I would have been a millionaire. Now, Monet did do more than 100 caricatures at this price, and he gave the money to his aunt for safekeeping because his parents didn't like this idea. They didn't approve at all. And every Sunday, he would take a batch of fresh drawings to the art supply store on the Rue de Paris in the main street of Le Havre, where the proprietor would frame these caricatures, hang them in the window, and he would walk by this paint shop every day, 3 times a day, he said, for the sheer joy of seeing people admire my work. I almost burst out of my skin with pride. Now, the proprietor of the store loved this sturdy, tall, young teenager, brash, arrogant. He had olive skin, bright dark eyes, long dark hair brushed back away from his face. And several times the owner of the art shop told Monet that he should meet Eugene Boudin, who was who did paintings of the sea and beaches, and he also hung those paintings in the art supply store next to the caricatures by Monet. Well, Monet says about this, I was so vexed at having to endure this conversation day to day that I did not tarry to slander this idiot who, thinking of himself as an artist, had dared to sign his work Boudin. His sincere little compositions, he said, with his correctly delineated little figures, his pleasant boats, his ever so perfect skies and water, drawn and painted only from nature, held no artistic value for me. His fidelity, he said, seemed suspect. Hence, his paintings inspired me with a terrible aversion, and without even having met the man, I disliked him intensely. Now, the framer would say, you should meet Mr. Boudin. Despite what's said about him, he is a professional and he's trained. He studied at the Paris Academy de Beaux-Arts. He could give you some useful advice. Monet said, I resisted. I dug my heels in. What could I possibly learn from such a ridiculous fellow? Take a look at those paintings. Now, Monet, being the arrogant teenager, resisted every attempt the store owner made for the two of them to meet. And many people in town didn't like Boudin. They thought he was mad because he lived like a tramp, he slept wherever he could. He used the money that he got from the pictures, which was often only for 1 or 2 francs, and Monet was selling his paintings for 20 francs. And Boudin would use that money to buy more canvases, and this influenced Monet's resistance. Once Boudin and Monet happened to be in the shop at the same time, and the proprietor introduced them. Monet said, "I was eventually won over by the older man, and I set up my easel every day with the intention to paint, but I spent hour upon hour just watching him." He said it was a revelation to watch the older man very slowly capture on canvas the precise look and feel of the sky and the landscape. Suddenly it was as though a veil had been ripped from my eyes, and from that moment on, my way was clear, my destiny decreed. I would be a painter no matter what. I finally understood nature, and I learned at the same time to love it, and that was all because of Boudin. This was the first painting that Monet created after studying the work of Boudin. So he said, "Thus it was that Boudin, with his inexhaustible kindness, took it upon himself to educate me. I would analyze its forms with my pencil. I would study its colorations. 6 months later, notwithstanding my mother's objections, who was seriously becoming worried about my frequent visits with a man like Boudin, I squarely announced to my father that I intended to become a painter and I was moving to Paris to learn." Now, Claude's family was not very happy about his vocation for painting or the fact that he was hanging around with a man who slept in the streets. His father did not encourage Monet to become an artist, but his aunt did, his father's sister. She let him use a room in her home as his studio, but she insisted that he get a formal education. On January 28th, 1857, Monet's mother died when he was only 16 years old, and that year he left school and he moved in with this widowed, childless aunt. Now, although he was a bit rebellious, as young artists often are, his ambitions were very clear from the beginning, and he got a great deal of support from his aunt. Now, Monet had heard about the Paris art world, and he also heard that no one in the French art world ever considered painting landscapes. They didn't think of them as important as historical or mythological pictures. Art school didn't even teach landscape painting. It was completely against the current fashion of classical academic art. They would never even teach painting of ordinary people in ordinary clothes. Successful French artists would choose serious educational subjects from French history. They might choose a subject from Greek or Roman mythology. There was nothing in their paintings that reflected contemporary life. And they were painting in studios with models wearing costumes. They used the dark colors to reflect the seriousness of the subject or the nobility of painting. Absolutely no one was painting outdoors. They made sketches and they brought them into the studio if they painted anything outdoors at all. Now Monet was 18 and he had to see what the great painters were doing in Paris. So Boudin had received a grant to study art in Paris. And in 1858, Monet's father agreed to apply to the city council to see if he could get a grant for Monet to study art in Paris. But before the council even acted on the request, young Monet left for Paris in 1858. He had a very small allowance in his pocket, the money that he left that his aunt had saved for him, and he arrives in Paris to see some of the paintings that were featured at the Salon. Now, the Salon was this great glass-roofed exhibition hall in the center of Paris where more than 2,000 paintings hung on the walls and thousands of people visited each day. All of the artists wanted to have their work accepted at the Salon, and it was the only way to be judged, to gain recognition, and the best way to find buyers. But the judges who decided which pictures would hang in the Salon were the painters and the teachers who admired the traditional ways of painting, that academic style. Now, in May of 1859, the city finally responded to Monet's father's request and denied it. Monet's father ordered him home, and Claude refused. His father said to him, "Then you will not get a penny from me." And Monet said, "Then I shall do without." So he promptly contacted his aunt, who had been holding the rest of his money from the sale of his caricatures, and she sent him $6,000 that he had saved up. So he rented a room in the neighborhood where all of the artist studios were, where all the cafes were, where the painters and the poets would flock together. And as far as his art education goes, Monet's aunt encouraged him to study with Thomas Couture, who was a respected artist and a teacher of the official French art school, L'École des Beaux-Arts. Now, Couture had just written a textbook on painting, and he had triumphed at the Salon with this particular painting, Roman of the Decadence. It's a huge painting, 25 feet wide by 15 feet high, and the painting showed these half-dressed men and women drinking and reclining in a splendid classical banquet setting, which was intended to teach the moral lesson that corruption and indulgence had sapped the strength of the Romans. And it was just the kind of thing, this imaginary historical scene where the models are posed and there's this false grandeur, that Monet detested. He disliked Couture personally because of these paintings. So he refused to study with the teachers from the official art schools. Instead, he went to l'Academy Suisse. That was a free studio in Paris where the artists chipped in to pay for models, and they worked without the criticism of teachers, which is what Monet liked. Now, the Academy Suisse was on the second floor of a small building in the center of Paris. And Monet said the Academy was run by a man who had once been a model. We called him Father Suisse. His name was Pierre Suisse. And we were at the top of the stairs next to the dentist's office. Sometimes the dentist patients would get lost and walk into our studio where they were squarely confronted by our nude models. Now, the studio was also the classroom of Camille Pissarro, a student who was 10 years older than Monet. The students were also found in the company of Delacroix, who had believed that line was not as important as color, and it was one of the most important lessons that Monet would say later on that he had learned from Delacroix. These are some of Monet's earliest paintings. So he did stay in Paris, but it ended abruptly. In the spring of 1861, he had to sign up for the military draft. Now, in France at the time, the draft worked like a lottery, and if you drew an unlucky number, then you were drafted for 7 years of military service. So unfortunately, Monet's draw was unlucky, and in 1860, he was drafted, and he had to join the military for 7 years. Now, it was possible at that time to buy out your military service by paying a substitute to take your place. Monet's father offered several times to buy out his son's stay in the army if he would give up painting and come back to run the family business. Of course, Monet refused. So he joined a unit called the African Light Infantry, which was based in Algeria, and the reason he joined this is because they wore dashing uniforms. Now, Monet was longing for adventure, and he leaves. The desert landscape, the violent sunshine was so different from where he came. He said, "The impression of light and color that I received there contained the germ of my future work." This was a painting done by Basile of Monet. Now, after more than a year in Africa, he caught typhoid fever, and he was sent home for a 6-month leave. When his convalescence came to an end, Monet's aunt, who had been following his art education, was now worried that he wasn't really progressing in his skills, and she decides, against the wishes of her brother, to buy out his military term. Now, his father finally gave in months later and promised Monet an allowance if he worked diligently and enrolled in the proper schools under a well-known master. Monet agreed, although he never did it. He studied under the same teacher as Frédéric Basile, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Alfred Sisley, Edgar Degas, and Paul Cézanne, and this is what they all looked like at the time that they met when they started studying together. This group of painting companions would be his allies and supporters for life. Now, all of these painters were very talented, but they all came from different backgrounds. The unifying force that bound this group together was their commitment and intense dedication to this new approach to art. They worked hard every day. They talked about it all night long in the cafes. Monet said every evening, Cicely, Basile, Renoir, Cézanne, Degas, and myself, along with a budding writer by the name of Émile Zola, would meet at the cafe. There was nothing more interesting than these discussions with their perpetual difference of opinion. Our minds and souls were stimulated. We would encourage each other to make unbiased and sincere research. We would nourish each other with enthusiasm, which had the power to sustain us for weeks on end until we were able to give definite form to our ideas. He said one would always leave the better immersed, the will stronger, our thinking more defined and clear. Now, at the time, among the established artists, teachers, critics, in Europe's highly political art world, the academic classical approach to art was the ideal that artists supposedly strived for. They placed emphasis on these classical subjects that were meant to have a symbolic message or a story, and that was the only way that was considered to be real art, is if there was a message and they adhered to this very defined classical academic format. The motifs that were drawn from contemporary life or the actual experience of the artists were not intended to give any kind of deep philosophical story or message, but the people who judge the art, the buyers, the teachers, the people who judge the work for the Salon, when they saw this kind of emotional work, the contemporary style of art that was representing life in a contemporary way, they looked at it as vulgar, as not really true art. So when these hippies of their generation came onto the scene, they were creating art that people were insulted by. Now, in 1863, after long study and dedication to this idea, which they called the climate of revolt against art, this group of artists were ready to submit their work to the Salon. Now, the jury for the Salon was especially severe that year, and they had accepted less than half of the over 5,000 works submitted. Now, led by Monet, many of the artists complained and went to the emperor himself, who then went to the Salon to look at the rejected canvases. He said that they didn't look any worse to him than the pictures that were already hanging in the Salon, so he decided to let the public be the jury, and he ordered all of the rejected canvases to be displayed in another part of the exhibition hall, and he wanted it to be called Salon de Refusés, which is the Salon of the Rejected. Now, crowds were larger that year than usual because it seemed that people were interested in seeing the rejected works of art. Among the rejected work was a work of art that was ridiculed by the public, and it was this painting by Edward Manet. It's called Luncheon in the Grass, and it completely shocked Paris. The public thought it was vulgar. The emperor himself pronounced it immodest. And Manet's brilliant technique and his daring choice of subject matter, this picnic with two women, one of them nude, and two fully clothed men, thrilled Monet and his friends. These avant-garde new artists loved the scandal that was around this painting. And the reason why this was considered to be vulgar and immodest is because the women are naked, not nude. If they were nude, they wouldn't have any clothes around to put on. They would look like Venus, just showing that. But there's a pile of clothes over there that they either just took off or they should have put on. So the painting was considered to be racist, vulgar. It was a casual painting that had radical color contrasts, the absence of that slick brushwork that the academic artists were measured by. It lacked that dark underpainting, the interplay of shadow with darkness. It was a very light painting. It wound up being the talk of this first exhibit of the rejected art, and it wound up bringing this group of artists who were looking for a climate of revolt against art, and this was the picture that was doing it. This became the nucleus of the future independent movement. It was born at this exhibit. So soon soon Monet and his friends turned away from that traditional style of painting inside of a studio. And with his friends, he went outside into the Fontainebleau forest to experiment with the open-air painting and the challenge, Monet said, of capturing light, shadow, weather, and seasons. He called the outdoors his natural studio. Now, those years quietly marked the beginning of this revolution in landscape painting in France that would eventually spread throughout Europe and the US. But the public and the art critics ridiculed these new paintings that looked so different from any of the conventional art style of the day. The critics said that Monet's seascapes were unquestionably the best they had ever seen, but they lacked the finish that comes from a truly educated painter. Now, what they meant by finish, and finish was demanded at this time, was the picture should have a surface as smooth as glass so that none of the brushstrokes were even visible. And critics would say this unfinished look that Monet put on his canvas, they would say this about him for his entire life. Now, despite Monet's efforts, the Salon, he kept submitting work, and the Salon kept rejecting his work. The Woman in the Green Dress he submitted in 1867. He wasn't totally surprised, though the Salon actually looked in disfavor of anything that was outside of academic standards of the time, and Monet's work clearly was. The figure was not part of any historical, literary, religious, or social message. It wasn't anything that you could really talk about. There's no storyline in the picture. The picture, like many of Monet's work, was not intended to convey any kind of a deep symbolic message, but it was created solely to give pleasure to the viewer. And that goal was considered to be unworthy of a true artist. Now, another reason why their work was not accepted into the Salon is because this group of avant-garde independent artists was very vocal about how they felt about classical painting, and the people who were judging their work were the professors and the academic leaders of the Salon, as well as l'École des Beaux-Arts, and they had snubbed their nose at those academics, and so they were pretty vocal about it. Of course, those judges didn't accept their work. The picnic was one of the first pictures Monet painted using real models, having a picnic outdoors. Incidentally, only the center of the picture remains, this 15 by 20 center. It was too large to carry at one point when he was moving from place to place, so he simply cut off the ends. The painting was accepted into the main exhibition hall at the Salon at the demand of the emperor. It won modest reviews, but it was still accepted into the Salon. And he was excited about this, but his parents weren't. Instead of being pleased with, or his father, I'm sorry, pleased with his success, they were outraged because they had learned that the beautiful young woman in the green dress at the center of the scene was Camille, a woman that Monet was living with without being married. And his father was angry about this and ordered him to break things off with her. When he refused, his father stopped his allowance, and that was the last bit of money he ever got from his father. So at 25 years old, he finds himself with no money. He had to get away from his creditors. He and Camille fled to the country, and there they began to work on another large life-size painting. It showed 4 women among the trees and flowers. Incidentally, all 4 women are Camille, because he couldn't afford models anymore. And he would say of this painting, "I was determined to paint all of my pictures outdoor and on the spot. At first, this seemed impossible because the canvas was so tall. I solved the problem by digging a trench among the flower beds so I could lower the canvas when I wanted to paint the top, and then he would put it at ground level when he wanted to paint the bottom." Now, Monet and Camille had to move again because they could not pay the rent. They were forced to leave several canvases behind. That's when he slashed the one and just took the center panel. He also took Women in the Garden with him, although he continued working on that for a great deal of the time. Now, he had hoped to introduce Camille to his aunt and his father and hopefully win them over, but they refused to meet her. She must be immoral, they would say. When Monet ran out of money to buy canvases, he asked Basile to send him the pictures that he left back in Paris so that he could scrape them, clean them, and reuse them again. To help out, Frederick Basile bought Woman in the Garden for 2,500 francs, which was about $7,500. And he agreed to pay Monet 50 francs a month, but he often forgot to send the money, and Monet would become frantic. His troubles were multiplied when he learned that now Camille was pregnant. Now, the jury of the Salon had rejected Women in the Garden, but had accepted this portrait of Camille. It kind of met the standards of the day. This new picture, as well as, this new picture, I apologize, met the standards of the day. And it was painted with a dappling of sunlight. It seemed strange and unsuitable, but it wound up being accepted for a brief time at the Salon and then eventually rejected for the final exhibit. So now he's desperate for money, and Monet had appealed to his father, begged him to send money, and his father said, "I will, as long as you give up Camille," which was interesting because Adolphe had a mistress for the majority of Monet's life, and he had just given birth to a child with her. Meanwhile, Camille grew very pale. Monet wrote to his friends that he barely had any strength to hold his brushes. He needed to get money to pay for a nurse for Camille and the necessities of the baby that was coming later. And he decides to pretend to give up his family. He takes Camille to Paris in 1867, and he manages to sell 2 paintings. This was one of them, which incidentally sold in 2009 for $16 million at Christie's. And he promised that any paintings that he would sell, he would give the money to Camille. He went back to Le Havre, promising to send Camille his money, every franc that he earned, and he promised to acknowledge the child as his own. He spent the summer dependent on his family, telling them that he had given up Camille. He wrote to his friends, begged them to send money to Camille so that she had something when the baby was born. And it was during these desperate times that his style changed dramatically. He started applying color directly to the canvas instead of mixing it on the palette, and he used small dots and dashes of color to catch what he called the flickering vibration of light on water. These were some of his most revolutionary paintings when he was living with his family, pretended to give up Camille, and started to really focus on his art. He spent all of his time outdoors learning about natural light. He said, "I often feel like I had been born blind and I had suddenly gained sight." The joy that he had in his work now was not matched by any improvement in his financial situation. People still weren't buying his work. And Camille's parents were now very concerned about Camille, and they made it known that if Monet and Camille would marry, they would help them out financially. So they were married in 1870, and Monet's family, of course, refused to attend the ceremony. He lived with his in-laws, and it was a very happy time, but it ended quickly. The Franco-Prussian War now broke out, and Monet was forced to flee to England. Basile, his very good friend who was helping to support him, joined the army that year, but he was killed in battle. Renoir was in the cavalry, and Boudin was out in Brussels. The home that they left, where all of these artists kept their original paintings, the beginning of the independent style of art, was held in this house, and it was taken over by the Prussians, and all of the paintings were destroyed. The soldiers would take the canvas off of the frames and use the canvas as a rug for the blood and the mud of the war. Now, in September of 1870, following France's declaration of war against Prussia, Monet took refuge in London. And while he was in England, he met an art dealer by the name of Paul Durand-Ruel, who would follow this independent group of artists throughout their careers. Now, Durand was in search of young painters, and he was struck by Monet's work. And he offered to buy his paintings for 300 francs each, which was a huge gamble because Monet wasn't really recognized as an established artist at this point. But needless to say, Monet jumped at the opportunity, and he claims later on that Durand was my salvation. In January of 1871, Monet's father died, and his inheritance was almost nothing because his father eventually married his mistress, and their children received the estate. Now, in the fall of 1871, he returns to France and he settles in Argenteuil, which was only about 15 minutes from Paris, so that he could paint along the banks of the Seine River. Once he was there, he fixed up a boat. He made it his floating studio. Remember, nature was his canvas. And with an easel on his deck, he painted his way up and down the river, searching for the means to capture the impression of interplay in light and water and atmosphere. These were his words. In 1873, he was starting to know some real prosperity. His income was $75,000 that year. The art dealer that he had met in London came to Paris and bought many of the paintings and was selling them in England and also in the U.S. Monet was still discouraged about the lack of recognition by the Salon, and eventually he and his friends, the other independent group of artists, banded together and called themselves Société Anonyme, the Anonymous Society of Artists. In 1874, they exhibited their work together just before the annual Salon exhibition, and very few people came, and there were a lot of critics who ridiculed the art. It was there at that exhibit where the term Impressionist was coined. Monet's painting called Impression Sunrise was the advertisement for this exhibit, and this painting especially outraged one critic. He said, this group of rebel artists aren't making paintings at all, they're just creating impressions of paintings. And it wasn't meant to be a compliment. One critic said the Impressionists apply paint like tongue lickings. Another singled out Monet's paintings as the most absurd daubs in the laughable collection. And newspapers printed cartoons mocking and ridiculing this new group of independent artists that were now called the Impressionists. Now, the Impressionist painters were not alone in their thinking about art in a new way. Some musicians now were trying to imitate light and color using these new techniques. Orchestral music could create the illusion of color by using different instruments in an unusual combination. And French composers like Maurice Ravel, Claude Debussy were writing piano music that let us kind of hear the flashing and glimmering of these Impressionist artists, what they were putting on their canvas. And today, these composers are known as the Impressionist composers. Did you know that? I love when I teach you something new. Claude Debussy was a French composer in this group of Impressionist composers, and he said that he was trying in his music to imitate light and color just like the Impressionist painters. And although he was 22 years younger than Monet, he acknowledged the influence that the Impressionist artist had on his music. In fact, he said that I feel closer to the painters and poets than to other musicians. He is regarded as the leader of Impressionism in music, and he would say that his nocturnes are an impression of light and shadow. I know you're going to go home and listen to nocturnes now. Although their first exhibit was a financial failure, and none of the other exhibits beyond that were particularly successful either, the Impressionists did continue to exhibit with each other until 1886. They were bitterly disappointed with the outcomes of the show. They thought every time that Mary Cassatt bankrolled another exhibit that maybe this time they would catch on. Incidentally, in 1875, they actually had an auction of the work by Monet, Renoir, Sisley, and Pissarro, and it actually resulted in violence. The auctioneer had to call the police to keep the people from tearing the canvases with their canes and umbrellas. That's how much they hated this artwork. It produced an insulting amount of money, and all the friends helped to support each other during these times. Some of these canvases actually sold for somewhere between $5 and $10. Now, Monet now faced another money crisis in the fall of 1876. After he paid off all of his creditors and the debt that he owed, Camille started to become a little ill, and an art collector by the name of Ernest Howe came to Monet's rescue. He was a Parisian businessman who had inherited a great fortune from his father's business, who was a merchant of fine lace and shawls. And he married Alice, who came from a very wealthy Belgian family. Now, they admired the Impressionists, and they bought a lot of their paintings. And of course, Monet was willing to do anything he could to continue to keep Ernest Howe buying these paintings. He had no money for paints and brushes, and Howe would advance him money to buy whatever he needed in hopes that that painting would be allowed to be bought by Ernest Howe and put in his collection. And it was during this desperate time that Monet was now starting to explore some different styles of art. From the 1860s until the end of that century, France was in love with all things Japanese. And it inspired the artists and the public as well. And Monet was not immune to this trend, which was now sweeping the country. I'm going to show you a painting that's probably going to shock you. This is a painting that Monet did of Camille, which he completed in 1875, which currently hangs in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And it was a complete contrast to the work that he had been doing up to this point that he was not selling. In his desperation, he created this large-scale figure painting, and Camille is depicted dressed in this elaborate kimono, holding a Japanese fan, which incidentally, Monet always loved Japanese fans. He had a great collection of them. And it's interesting to note that she is wearing a blonde wig so that she emphasizes her Western identity. He did this to enhance the chance of selling his work. But because of this, it was kind of forced, there was really no spontaneity in this like there was in his work previous to this time. The scene looks very contrived. However, the brilliance of the colors that he used was breathtaking. So he exhibits this at one of the independent exhibitions where it attracted a lot of attention, but no buyers. Now, Monet was very saddened of the fact that he had kind of given in, and he felt a little guilty about the compromise that he made to do this work just so that maybe he could attract some buyers. And he later describes this painting as trash, a concession to the popular taste of the time and nothing more. Now, that wasn't enough. He tried something new. He still wasn't selling his paintings, and 1877 was a disastrous year for Monet. His expenses were high. He had kept out the household in Argenteuil. He owed a great deal of money on the studio that he had in Paris. None of his paintings were selling, and more importantly, Camille was pregnant again and now getting very sick. There was also bad financial news elsewhere. In the spring of 1878, Ernest Howe had mismanaged his inheritance, and he was forced into bankruptcy, and he lost everything, including the chateau that belonged to his wife, who had mortgaged it, and eventually it was claimed by the creditors. All of his Impressionist paintings had to be sold off, and at first the man tried to commit suicide, and then he decided he was just going to run. So he went to Belgium without his family. Now, the Monet family was in unhappy circumstances as well. After Monet's second son, Miguel, was born, Camille was in worse health than ever. Manet went to see Monet and found him absolutely on the rocks of despair. And Monet begged Manet to just buy some pictures so that he could get the medicine that he needed for Camille. Monet was frantic. He constantly appealed to his friends and fellow artists to help him. He would try to sell his paintings out into the street. He never received any money for them. And as he tried to economize, he eventually moved out of his home in Argenteuil into Paris just to try to keep his family together and keep the rent low. With Manet's help, Monet found a house to rent down the Seine River in Veltheil, which is where the rents were a lot cheaper. Now, to complicate matters, all 8 members of the Howe family, including Ernest, who had come back from Belgium to reclaim his wife and children, joined the Monets in this small house, and none of them had any money. Monet, however, worked desperately hard to sell any paintings that he could. Howe said he was going to pay 2/3 of whatever was due for the household costs, but he failed time and time again. Instead, he would just rack up bills in the neighborhood. Monet was delighted when Mary Cassatt, an American Impressionist painter, bought one of his pictures for $300. So now he was trying to go to Paris to get some money for a pharmacist, for a Camille's doctor. He was very unsuccessful. He wound up having actually to take Camille's locket, something that she had owned from her family, and sold it during their years of poverty. Now Camille was dying of cancer, stomach cancer, and in terrible pain. Alice, Ernest's wife, nursed her as best she could. She worked hard to take care of all of the children, and Camille finally died in 1879 at the age of 32. Now Monet decides again to try for the Salon, the first time in a long time, and the decision horrified his Impressionist friends, but he felt like he needed to do anything he could to help bring in some money. He submitted 2 pictures, but the judges only accepted them and hung them so high that they could hardly be seen. This is a sketch that he put into the newspaper in response to the fact that even though they accepted his pictures, they were up there, you needed a propeller to get up to the top to see them. And he never tried to enter the Salon again. Now, his financial situation improved slightly when Durand, the art dealer that he met in London, found some backing from a bank that was opening, and he was able to open his gallery in 1881. And he sold some seascapes that Monet had given him, and Durand also financed a trip to the sea in hopes that maybe more seascapes would sell. Normandy, incidentally, was the first region in France that was exploited as a site for tourism, and Durand financed a trip for Monet to go to Normandy to paint some pictures in hopes that he could sell them. The area's natural scenic beauty provided subjects for Monet that was well suited to his style, and it helped him with his fascination of light and atmosphere, time and season. Incidentally, there's a story that he tells about one time when he was on the shore, he decided that he wanted to paint the storm that was at sea. So he found a hollow in the cliff where he could plant his easel. He lashed it down with strong cords. He fastened the canvas to the easel, and he began watching this storm coming in, and he wanted to finish the canvas before the rain fell. The water was now rising and pounding. The storm got bad pretty fast. Monet ignored it. He said, "I painted furiously," and suddenly an enormous wave picked him up and threw him in the water. For a while, he said he contemplated suicide and not to come up, but eventually he was swept away because he let go of the easel that was tied to the rocks, and he grabbed onto a boat, a fishing boat, where there were 2 fishermen who happened on around the edge of the cliff and rescued him. Now, this region also had become a fashionable holiday destination for Parisians, which encouraged Monet to create paintings that the tourists might be interested in. And he had his depictions of the cathedral, the grain stacks, which are not haystacks, incidentally. They're grain stacks. Haystacks are those little candies made of coconut and chocolate. Anyway, this new vision of Normandy and the grain stacks and the poplars was kind of a way that Monet thought that he might find his place among the giants of art. He made $93,000 during that year with the sale of his seascapes, his grain stacks, and his cathedral facades, and that was the year of 1882, the most he had made in many years, and it was mainly because this work was being sold in the U.S. Now, Monet, having a little bit of money, eventually moved his family to Giverny. Alice, who decided to move in now with Monet because her husband had abandoned her yet again and left her pregnant, she wound up staying to nurse Camille and to help take care of Monet's children, but her abandonment by her husband and the fact that now Monet was moving into a house that had some room for her, she simply had nowhere else to go, and Monet's boys needed her, so Monet invited her to stay with him. He took one of the dirt-floored barns for his studio. He put in large windows for the children. He began at once to plant a vegetable garden in order to have vegetables for the table, and a flower gardens so that he would have flowers from which to paint his still life pictures on rainy days. He said the garden, sloping gently to the south, was warm and sunny. I dug up spruce and cypress, clipped boxwood bushes, planted roses that climbed on metal arches. He was often the first one to dive off the cabin roof into the Seine River. He always brought the children with him. Alice would stay home and sew. In the winter, he said the shallow water in the marsh would freeze, and we would ice skate. And in the spring, the whole family went mushroom hunting. Life was good at Giverny. He was now middle-aged. He was still big and handsome, brown beard, bright eyes, although these are pictures of him when he's a little older. He treasured all of the children, including Alice's children, as though they were his own, and everyone, including Alice, the servants, would call him Monet. Now, eventually, Ernest Howe died in 1891, and the following year, Monet marries Alice. Between the two of them, they had 8 children, and they lived on as before, and they were extremely happy. Monet got up every morning at 4 or 5 o'clock. He said, I studied the sky. If it was rainy, I went back to bed. If it was fair, I would stay up. He said, after a big breakfast, often accompanied by Alice's daughter Blanche, I would start out into the countryside wearing a beret and wooden shoes like the ones the local farmers wore, pushing my painting equipment in a wheelbarrow. He came back at home at 11 for lunch, a cup of coffee in the studio, perhaps a glass of plum brandy. He said if the light was good, I went out to paint again, and dinner was always at 7. He thrived in this happy routine of Giverny, but he also had a terrible temper, which could be set off by an unexpected visitor, a mishap in the kitchen, maybe bad weather. When he was very angry about his work, the children would kind of disappear and avoid him for a while. He said Alice would always jolly me out of my mood. He was also very unforgiving about his work, and he destroyed hundreds of pictures, burning them, many canvases at a time. Once in a fit of anger, he kicked his foot through this painting. This is actually at the Boston Museum, and sometimes they pull it up away from the wall and put it on an easel, and you could see the back of it where he repaired it. Another time, he said, I was frustrated while on my studio boat, and I decided to give up painting forever and threw my paints and palettes and brushes into the river. He said the next day I had a change of mind and I wanted to work, but it was Sunday. No paint store was open, so I wired Paris, an obliging dealer, went to the store and sent them the supplies on the next train to Giverny. Now, in 1886, Durand Ruel, Monet's dealer, was doing so poorly selling his paintings in France, he was in such financial straits that he decided to take a trip to America to try to send the paintings there. And he organized an exhibit of 300 paintings at the New York and American Academy of Art. Among them were 49 works of art by Monet, and the American critics were ecstatic. Now Monet's troubles were over. He sold 20 paintings for around $45,000 each to the Americans, who had now appreciated the art that the French still were not accepting. Now, when his landlord decided to sell the Giverny house in 1890, he had been renting it up to this point, Monet was able to buy it, and he built a new studio, a garden, an old barn studio near the garden, where he put a wooden floor, and it became the family sitting room and his studio. Once again, he set out to improve his gardens. He said the chalk subsoil was near the surface, and it enhanced his flower beds, and he enriched them with imported earth. He subscribed to gardening magazines. He sought the advice of his friends. He hired a number of gardeners. He also imported exotic plants, built greenhouses, devised elaborate planting schemes so that he would have color all year long. And his gardens grew famous. He eventually bought another plot of land in the village where he could plant vegetables for his family, but he left all the flower beds around the house. He became a celebrity as the years went by, not so much for being a painter, but for being an extraordinary gardener as well. The proprietress of the village grocery store actually had to move out of her house so that she could rent rooms to visiting artists who wanted to see Monet. Theodore Robinson, for example, an American Impressionist painter who became a friend of Monet's, eventually bought a house in Giverny. John Singer Sargent was very often seen in the company of Monet. At one time, there were 40 American artists working in Giverny, so many of them that the grocery store began to sell paints and canvases for these artists. When they would ask him for advice, he would simply say, just look at nature. Now, the American money that he had from selling his paintings allowed him to buy additional land to build his famous gardens, greenhouses, additional buildings, and also to divert a stream for his pond, this dream pond, that he wanted to build a Japanese bridge over. He also built another studio, and eventually he hired 6 full-time gardeners. He bought all of the land surrounding his home. He dug a large, deep pond, and he planted new hybrid strain of water lilies, and eventually built a bridge over the pond. Monet's garden was the key to his success, he said, a starting point for my fame. He knew that he was a professional gardener and he would be admired for his skills, but he also knew that he could paint those gardens very well. He would write daily instructions to his gardening staff, very precise designs and layouts for his plantings, and invoice for his floral purchases. He collected a number of botany books. Every morning, a gardener would boat around the pond next to Claude Monet's house in Giverny and meticulously clean the water lilies that had collected soot from the passing, the debris that went along the water. The master, Monet, always insisted that when he got out into this boat in the morning, the water lilies had to be perfect. This was the scene for Monet's last great drama, his battle to paint the water and the lilies, water lilies that were bathed in light and air. He first painted the pond in 1892, and by 1904 he had painted the pond 320 times. He made these studies of water lilies and reflections in the water, and now is when he started to have trouble with his eyes. But he still painted on. Again, he showed the work to Durand. He exhibited 48 of these paintings. They seemed to be like paintings no one had ever seen before. All of the critics praised them in England. They were described as upside-down landscapes. But unfortunately, the panels seemed to belong together, and no one person wanted to buy one panel and separate them. That was a good thing, because Monet had already decided that he wanted them all displayed together in a circular room, which would be completely filled with paintings of flowers and water, and he refused to sell any of his water lilies. Now, Alice became very ill. She died of leukemia in 1911. Blanche, the daughter of Alice, eventually married Monet's son, Jean. That woman in the center in the white is Blanche. She looks exactly like Alice, maybe just a little heavier. Jean is on her left. That was the son of Monet. And they cared for Monet until his death. He grew very despondent as his eyesight worsened. He buried himself in his work. He said, "My work is my only consolation," after Alice had passed. Visitors, including art critics, came to his studio to watch him paint. He said it seemed like the water and sky had no end at this point. It was as though the critics or the visitors would say, it was as though we were present at one of the first hours of the birth of the world. The paintings were mysterious and poetic. But he still would not sell any of the canvases. Now, on November 11th, 1918, the day that World War I ended in victory for France over her allies in Germany, Monet decided to donate all of the water lily panels to the nation, his nation, France, to celebrate the victory, 12 frames in all that were 15 feet in length. France refused them. It took him 4 years and a number of attorneys to get them to finally agree to accept this donation. Now there were stipulations. He was pretty angry. They had to be hung in a special building where the viewer could see them all around him in a circular room with no straight lines. Now, the French government didn't want them to begin with, and now they were reluctant to build a building specifically for his request, it took a lot of negotiating to work out an agreement between the French government and Monet to find a building that was suitable for the water lilies. Monet insisted that they be hung in a circular building, and the French government didn't want to have the cost. So finally they came up with a compromise. They used the empty building near the Louvre that had once housed orange trees grown for the palace, and with great expense to France, which I think Monet enjoyed, the orangerie was redesigned to an oval shape to accommodate the water lilies. Monet agreed to sign a contract when he was satisfied with the plans, but there was one more stipulation. His paintings would line the walls and nothing else would ever be exhibited there. And the French government agreed. They were kind of tired of him at this point. Monet was pleased. He increased now his commitment of 12 paintings to 18 in order to fill the building. And he began working on these large paintings, but his eyesight was worsening, and it became difficult for him to see what he was painting. He couldn't see color anymore. He said, "I wasn't sure what the work really looked like. The panels were very difficult to complete." During that summer, he burned many of the canvases. He finally agreed to have a cataract operation, and in 1923, the first of 2 operations in one eye was successful enough that he said he could see odd things that he had been doing with his paintings. A second operation helped him see a little better, but he said, "I still had trouble perceiving color. Sometimes things looked blue, other times yellow. Glasses made things better and sometimes worse." He said, "The doctors were unable to explain what was happening to me, and I destroyed more paintings." By September, things seemed to be a little better, and he reported that his sight was almost perfect, that he could actually read without difficulty, but he still had a great deal of trouble with color. He said, "I no longer saw colors with the same intensity." He was losing his patience. He had to stand back several yards in order to see his work. He said, "The reds are muddy, the pinks insipid, the intermediate colors and lower tones escape me completely." Now a new doctor prescribed new glasses, and then miraculously he could paint again. July of 1925, Monet said he could see better with one eye than he ever did with 2. From 1914 until 1926, the only thing he painted was the water lilies and the bridge. Now, this serial image that he created of just the water lilies was his symbolic resistance to academic painting. With this linear perspective and fixed structure, he kind of reinforced the argument that nature was timeless and that he needed to repeat it. Unfortunately, during the winter of 1925, even though he had created this slice of eternity, his health began to fail, and it became apparent that the man who had chain smoked for most of his life now had lung cancer. His last years were difficult. He was growing weaker, but nonetheless, he continued to work on his series. He struggled, but he continued working. He eventually died December 5th, 1926, at the age of 86, before he ever saw the water lilies hung in the orangerie. They were unveiled in May 20th of 1927. And that was Monet's greatest achievement. Not only was the orangerie in the heart of the modern city that had provided he and the other independent artists with so many of their early subjects, he was delighted in reminding interviewers that the orangerie was also opposite of the old Salon who had rejected his work so many times. One critic who went into the show, to the exhibit, saw the panels just after their opening, and he said, "Monet was able to conduct his orchestra until the end. There is not the slightest discord. Generally, when I leave a painting exhibit, I'm glad to see the sky, the trees, and the streets again. When I left water lilies, everything looked dry and flat to me. I will go back often." He was now celebrated as the gift to France. The paintings were celebrated as the gift to France, even though they were rejected over and over, and to the world. In his final days, he only talked about his water gardens, the fact that he wanted to be surrounded by flowers. He said, everything I've earned has gone into my gardens. My gardens are my most beautiful masterpiece." His funeral was simple. as he requested. There were no speeches, no religious service. The mourners walked in procession from his house to a churchyard in Giverny, where he was buried. In 1927, only months after his death, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston paid tribute to his memory with a major retrospective of his paintings, the first and the most commemorative, important event that was held for an artist, in honor of an artist, anywhere in the world. Michel Monet, the artist's surviving son, inherited his father's estate, including the property at Giverny and, of course, the contents of his studio. He chose to live elsewhere, but he allowed Blanche to continue living at Giverny after Jean passed, until her death in 1947, when stewardship for the property was taken by her brother, Jean-Pierre Hochety. Following Miguel Monet's death in a car crash in 1966, the contents of Claude Monet's studio were bequeathed to a small museum in France's L'Académie des Beaux-Arts, which eventually became Musée Marmottan. This collection was hailed as one of the greatest art treasures of the world, and in 1966 it was valued at $10 million. Now, the Académie des Beaux-Arts suddenly found itself with more than 130 paintings, watercolors, pastels, which trace the evolution of a great man's career in one single museum. It included more than 60 paintings of Monet's house at Giverny, the water lilies, his everlasting fantasy. It also included the House of Parliament series, the Cathedral series, as well as a portrait of Pierre Renoir that was owned by Jean Monet. And it also originally housed the original Impression sunrise, for which the Impressionist artists were named. The home and the gardens at Giverny, which had languished for many years, were brilliantly restored and opened to the public in May of 1980, and they are meticulously maintained by the Claude Monet Foundation. He had worked his entire life to attain one goal: to paint light and nature as he saw it for a fleeting moment. With very little formal art training, he endures the most wretched poverty, the alienation of his family, the insults and the ridicule of his countrymen and an uncompromising public. But he accomplished what he set out to do, which he said in 1900 was to forever change the way we see the world. He said, "I want the unobtainable. Other artists paint a bridge, a house, a boat, and that's the end, they're finished. I want to paint the air that surrounds the bridge, the house, the boat, the beauty of the air in which these objects are located, and that's nothing short of impossible." And that's the story of Monet.
Thanks to the management and staff of the Hudson Library and Historical Society for their assistance in the production of this program, and for providing the Through the Eyes of the Artist series for the citizens of Hudson. For a DVD or Blu-ray copy of this or any HCTV program, contact Hudson Cable Television at 330-653-2500 or via email at hctv@hudson.oh.us.